A third of Americans live below the poverty line, and another third were right around the poverty line. So two-thirds of Americans are what we would call today poor or extremely poor. Owners, worried that workers will demand unions and better conditions, developed the idea of welfare capitalism. And this is where the owners offer benefits and some compensation to prevent a demand for union among the workers. Henry Ford is really the leader in this effort. He shortened the work week, he raised wages, and he began offering paid vacations. He did all this because he didn't want his workers creating a union, which is a little ironic today because we think of the United Autos Workers Union today as one of the most powerful unions, but pensions also begin to appear. The idea that if you work so long for your company, you can retire and still get a check during your retirement. And which creates the idea of retirement altogether. The idea of retirement didn't really exist before unless you were rich. Corporations organize workers' unions. So these are unions run by the company themselves to listen to workers' complaints. But when the economy crashes in 1929, all that becomes unraveled. These all begin to be seen as unnecessary expenses, and it all falls apart. Workers' wages remained low. Most families lived on several incomes. The husband and the wife would work, as well as any children who were old enough to work. The Red Scare philosophy, the whole idea that the communists were coming to take over America, had really limited unions, and even where there were unions, limited what they could accomplish. The American plan, it was called for open shops, meaning you couldn't require the workers to join a union to work somewhere. And of course, owners loved this. And so this whole idea that the communists were our great enemy really went towards limiting unions. In 1920, there were 5 million Americans in unions, but by 1929, that had dropped to 3 million, even though, of course, the population had increased. Ladies were in the workforce. They were called pink-collar jobs. We tend to call kind of working class, get your hands dirty jobs blue-collar. Office jobs are called white-collar. Women's jobs are pink-collar. Low-paying service jobs is what we're talking about. Secretaries, sales clerks, operating telephones. African Americans who had moved north and west in huge numbers during World War I, when there were lots of jobs available because the boys were all fighting, now find themselves relegated to jobs like janitors, dishwashers, garbage collectors, domestic servants. Unions wouldn't let women or blacks in for the most part, and so they had no real protection. One example of an African American union was the sleeping car porters union, and that was another big industry you could get a job in if you were African American. In the Southwest, low-skilled jobs, low-paying jobs, had historically been done actually by Asians, but more and more that is going to be taken over by Hispanics. Japanese begin to replace Chinese. Remember, we had banned Chinese immigration in 1882. More and more Japanese are going to become truck farmers. Two terms you might want to know. A Japanese immigrant, somebody born in Japan and moves to America, we call Isai. And first-generation Japanese, somebody born in America of Japanese-born parents, we call Nisai. In 1913 and 1920, California passes laws to stop Japanese from buying land. We also have a lot of Filipinos who've come to California since America has taken over the Philippines. And we have anti-Filipino riots in 1929 and 1934, which lead to laws limiting Filipino immigration to this country. 500,000 Mexican immigrants arrived in the 1920s. Now, this is on top of the people who had been here since the Mexican-American War and weren't really immigrants. They just got kind of sucked up into America because of the war. The Mexican immigrants tend to live in barrios in southwestern cities. They're discriminated against but welcomed in unpopulated areas that need workers. And so a lot of them end up being agricultural workers. There is no organized attempt to stop immigration at this time. If you look at this chart, by the way, you'll notice today when we think of immigration, we think of Hispanics. Well, Hispanic immigration barely even shows up on this chart until the 1920s, and then you see it disappear during the Great Depression and the war, and then it doesn't really become a significant factor until post-war. I always have kids ask about that. So, let's talk about farmers. The use of tractors increases by 400% over the decade. Combines and harvesters reduce the need for labor. And they open up 35 million new acres that can now be cultivated. Genetic research leads to hybrid crops that require less water, more resistant to bugs or plant blights. Chemical fertilizers are introduced, pesticides. All of this dramatically increases production, but it doesn't increase demand. Now, if production goes up, so supply goes up, and demand stays the same, prices drop. This is going to begin to become a crisis for the farmers who can grow more and more and more food, but they get less and less money for it. And 3 million Americans will leave agriculture as a way of life during this decade. And those who stay will struggle to keep their farms as crop prices collapse. Farmers begin to demand price support from the government. They want a parity, which is a formula to make sure that crop prices cover the cost it took to produce the crop. They also want high tariffs on foodstuffs that are in the country to prop up American farmers' prices. They wanted the government to buy the crop from the farmers directly and sell it to countries overseas. The McNary-Houghton bill tries to address these concerns in 1924, but doesn't pass. It does pass Congress in 1926 and again in 1928, but it's vetoed by, Coolidge the first time and Hoover the second time. And so the farmers will not see relief, and we'll see the results of that as we get into the Great Depression.